Well, so totalitarian systems, or this is Hannah Arendt, are always engaged in the permanent lie as opposed to the expedient lie. Politicians always lie, as I have said, all governments lie. So Clinton wants to shove NAFTA down our throat and tells us it will create millions of wonderful, well-paying jobs. But it doesn't. George W. Bush tells us that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, except there weren't. Well, Bush and Clinton don't run around now saying that, NAFTA created millions of jobs, and Bush doesn't say that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The permanent lie has no fealty to the truth at all. And it becomes kind of schizophrenic because even what in a totalitarian system you see in front of you is denied. It doesn't matter how many pictures Trump shows of the inauguration crowd, his was the largest in history. I mean, that's the permanent lie.
And that's the very interesting point that I wonder what's going to happen at the debates when you have the Democrats who will put up some dopey character like Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren. They won't pick Sanders, even though Sanders could most likely beat Trump quite easily. But they'll put up somebody like Sanders and Biden, and Trump will just be pulling out all the lies that he usually says, like when he's talking on Twitter, he's constantly telling people the economy is the greatest it's ever been, jobs are better than they've ever been, yada, yada, yada. He just constantly lies about what's actually happening. And I don't really know who actually believes these things. I guess somebody must, but whatever the case, he just lies about everything, and makes out like everything is great, even though it obviously isn't the experience of everyday Americans. They are not experiencing any sort of the economic growth that Trump talks about. They're not experiencing any benefits from that. And most people now are in some sort of dire poverty. But the thing is, when these debates are happening, Trump will just lie like a rug, and it will be that permanent lie that Chris Hedges is talking about. And I can't see how any Democrat, the dopey ones that will be put up against him, will be able to counter that. Not that I'm saying they don't lie; they lie like rugs too, but they don't probably do it in as crass a way as Donald Trump does, and maybe not as often, but they lie too. But their lies will not be able to counter the lies of Donald Trump, I think.
That's certainly another aspect of the kind of despotism that has enveloped the country, because that's how he operates, and it's different from the expedient lie, and it knocks people off balance, because there's just you cannot have any discourse that anymore is grounded in verifiable fact or reality. That's another step towards tyranny.
And we also have this here in Australia, this step towards tyranny, because the lies that are told here by the Scott Morrison government, and even the Labor governments beforehand, but it's much, much worse now with the Scott Morrison government here in Australia. He tells lies like Trump. I mean, they take a leaf out of Trump's book, some of these people, and they just tell lies about the economy, about everything, and it's not based in any sort of fact. And I don't know who believes it here, but somebody's voting for people like this. And the problem is that after a while, that this is all we're getting now. Governments around the world, they're just lying and saying things are getting better or things are great or whatever, and they're not. And people are getting poorer, and that's neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And I don't know how that's going to end. It probably will end in blood in the streets, because they're making it so that people cannot protest non-violently now. They're even doing that here in Tasmania. And like the saying goes, if you take away the ability for people to protest non-violently, well, then they're left with only violence. And that's probably what will be happening in the future, because as you'll hear in the end of this interview, I'll play the end bit, the last minute or so. Chris Hedges says that they will keep going until they kill us all. And he means not in just relation to making everybody like serfs, but also the climate crisis. They will continue to ignore the climate emergency, and until we're all dead, basically. And I've read just recently some scientists are just saying, actually, at this point, it is too late now. At the tipping point, we've gone past that. Well, I knew that a while ago, but I mean, the scientists are actually saying that. A lot of scientists now are actually saying that.
Well, a lot of these people will say they're patriotic, Chris. They're not white nationalists. They're not nationalists. Of course, that has a negative connotation. I mean, is there a difference when you're looking at nationalism versus patriotism?
Sure, I would define patriotism as those activities or activity which makes your country and your community a better place. So for me, you could argue the greatest patriot of the 20th century was Martin Luther King. But patriotism has been perverted into a deification of the warrior class. Nationalism is a disease, and I watched nationalist and covered nationalist movements around the globe. So after 9/11, we drank that very dark elixir of nationalism, which is always racist and always about self-exaltation at the expense of the other.
And it's an interesting thing. I don't know why that is, that it's about self-exaltation over the other. I don't know if that is, I think that's become a global malaise to some extent in Western societies. It wasn't always like that, and I think that has escalated. I've noticed in Australia that we've adopted some of the mean-spiritedness of the, this so-called rugged individualism that is pushed in the United States, where it's sort of kind of a dog-eat-dog thing, and if somebody is poor or is homeless, then it's their fault. It has nothing to do with the system. It's just their fault. And that is such a lie. And I think Malcolm X said, eventually the mainstream media will have you believing, lies about, people's condition. They'll have you hating the people that are disenfranchised. Well, mission accomplished. That's actually happening now. And you find there's a lot of people in the United States have contempt for homeless people who are just victims of a neoliberal, neoconservative system and a structural racism. And that's appalling. That's where I talk about a spirit, this is where I think it's a spiritual malaise that has beset that country, where if you're vilifying, and they have been doing that for some time now in the United States, vilifying homeless people, then that indicates a kind of spiritual death in society, because and the governments are actually doing all these things to make it impossible for homeless people to even exist. They're already in a dreadful state, and they're making it so that there's nowhere they can actually stay. I mean, it's absolutely, there are no words to describe how appalling that is. And yet there are a lot of US citizens that don't give a toss about homeless people, and that includes veterans. If the US hadn't had a government that didn't care about them and wasn't always just serving corporations in the military-industrial complex, they may have actually had much better care themselves, and also not been impoverished, and maybe sort of recognize that we need to care for each other, that it's about you and I, and about looking after our community. But neoliberalism and neoconservatism have destroyed communities. And so now we just have this sort of dog-eat-dog thing where people think that success is having lots of money and material possessions, and that when something goes wrong, and Chris Hedges talks about this later, when something goes wrong, instead of recognizing that we all have bad in us and we have good, they externalize this and put it on to other. And that means minority groups and Muslims and the like. And so then they start making them a target of violence. So this is sort of, and this can only lead to where it's leading, which is our eventual extinction. Because if we're not caring about one another and we don't see this whole planet as a global community, and if we're not internationalists, then what are we going to end up on? You know, what sort of situation are we going to end up in? The same sort of thing that is happening right now, where governments are doing what the hell they want and serving corporations, where people are not being listened to, where nonviolent protests are being ignored, where the military, the Pentagon and the military in the United States have been working on ways of controlling the crowds when when social breakdown occurs, which is coming and which is happening before our eyes. I mean, this is what we are winding up with, a sort of broken, dysfunctional species that is on the edge of extinction. And I feel like, as I said, I feel like if the United States government hadn't been this duopoly that just serves corporations and the military-industrial complex, they may have had a much kinder and more just society, and therefore they would not be externalizing them and vilifying the other, and then turning on them and making them targets of violence. And they wouldn't be grasping for this. That wars make them united, and that wars make them feel like they're alive and feel like they're dominating. Why do people feel they need to dominate? The only reason that happens is because they don't have their own sort of sense of self. They don't have a sort of self-worth. I mean, bullies are cowards, really. The white supremacist nationalist thing of going around and trying to homogenize the world to make it more palatable, which is what the United States is trying to do, trying to homogenize everything and Americanize everything and control everything with their mighty military and American imperialism. There is no room for other. I mean, here in Australia, the government here, I think they would be happy, and I'm not just joking when I say this. I think they would be quite happy if Australia returned to a white Australia policy. That's how sort of wannabe fascist the Scott Morrison government is here in Australia. So this is where we're at now. It's got to go. It either has to go the other way at some point, or we're just headlong. We're escalating our imminent extinction.
That when a country's convulsed by that kind of intoxication with nationalism, it is a temporary overcoming of the anomie or the dislocation or the despair or the alienation that much of the country feels. It's a false kind of camaraderie, but suddenly people feel that they're part of a cause. They feel that they belong again, and intellectuals are some of the most susceptible to this. And I was fighting these people. I was teaching in Princeton at the time. And they drank this Kool-Aid as deeply as everyone else. So it creates a situation where the critics, and I was one, are not just expressing another opinion, even though, of course, I'd come 7 years out of the Middle East, but you are actually attacking their right to exalt themselves. So
that's interesting, because, as I said, if U.S. citizens, I'm generalizing when I talk about the U.S., but if U.S. citizens had a government that looked after them as they're supposed to do, and if they had a more just and kinder society, and people weren't desperate and struggling, impoverished, and if there wasn't this terrible structural racism, and people weren't basically like that terrible sort of a description or metaphor, the crabs in a barrel all trying to climb over the top of one another to get out. If there wasn't that sort of situation, there might be more sort of, and if there had been a cultivation of looking after the disenfranchised. I mean, really, despite all these people who talk about Christian values, Christian values are actually looking after others, and particularly the disenfranchised. But there's no room for that. The Christian, in quotes, has been absolutely distorted and made into something else. And this is where he talks about Christian fascism. It has nothing to do with actual Christianity. It's sort of, he says, it's about the state and a sort of sanctifying state power. So But I just feel like if the US had a different way, if the government hadn't been taken over by corporations and the military-industrial complex, there may have been a different sort of a feeling in that society to look after people who are disenfranchised, and they wouldn't be grasping for war and to give themselves some identity. They wouldn't be grasping to dominate and to kill, which is sort of it's a sickness really now. And it's all rooted in this American exceptionalism, and that's at the root of it, really, of a belief that's been indoctrinated that somehow, if you're American, you're an exception, you're exceptional, and better than other people in the world, and therefore that's why there always, as I've probably mentioned before, that there is this need to homogenize the world and make it like them, like us, to make America, to make the whole world like America, and there is no room for other. So anyway, that's just my thoughts on it.
The calls to invade Iraq publicly, I would come into the New York Times and the phone messaging bank would be full of death threats.
Wow.
And it was that. It was these people who had been gripped by this enemy and had found in this cause a way. It's a kind of false route because it doesn't work in the end, but a way to reintegrate into a society that had turned against them. And anybody who challenged that, suddenly it was an existential challenge. It just wasn't a political challenge. Getting rid of Trump doesn't solve.
And how sad is that people have so little sense of self that they have to grasp on to something like that, a common cause of a war that was based in lies, and that's what unites them. I mean, how sad is that that's what they think gives them meaning, war, instead of all the other wonderful things that we could have if we hadn't had a breakdown of community due to neoliberalism and all of that. We would have had something different. And certainly in the United States, they would have had something different instead of the impoverished and desperate crabs in a barrel situation that they have now.
Well, the problem, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out, Pence will be worse, and Noam is right. We are a deeply diseased society. And my last book, which was America, the Farewell Tour, which is pulled from Durkheim, is about what Durkheim calls that anomie, the breaking of those social bonds that, as Durkheim, the great French sociologist, writes, creates a system whereby people engage in self-destructive behavior, whether that's the opioid crisis, suicide, gambling is another one. I wrote her out of the Trump-tage before Trump even announced. But also, as Durkheim correctly points out, hate groups, because he says those who fervently seek the annihilation of others are really driven by longings for self-annihilation. And I write it.
I believe that too, that, if you have no sense of self-worth, if you don't care about yourself, then, and you feel like you don't belong, then you will probably gravitate. Your anger will allow you to gravitate towards hate groups, and then you find a common purpose, which is hating and which is destroying the other groups. And it's certainly never, ever directed really at the governments that are actually causing their suffering. It's directed at minority groups. It's the bully's way, a coward's way of addressing one's own hurt and disillusionment with everything. It's a bully's way, a coward's way of dealing with the vacuum that can never be filled, because there's been, as Chris Hedges said, the breakdown of community, which has been an intentional thing. So people cannot organize. So people lack empathy. This has been an intentional thing on behalf of neoliberalism and governments to actually break down society, break down communities so that people cannot organize, so people do not feel empathy for one another. And it's worked, because I think you can see it reflected in the way people react to disenfranchised people now. It's even here in Australia, which I find very frightening. I find what's happening here in Australia these days, it's the country is almost unrecognizable to me at this point.
Chapter, I'm with the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters. So if we don't address that enemy, if we don't address the rupture of the social bonds that allows for a healthy society, getting rid of Trump ain't gonna make any difference.
But how can the left ever challenge what is going on, this kind of decay institutionally?
And how do we actually develop a healthy society? That's a good question, because it seems like there are some people that are they're recognizing that the lack of community is what is causing this breakdown with everything, and so they're trying to develop community again. And I'm not talking about communities online. I'm talking about in real life. That's one way I see people pushing back. But then on the other hand, I can't see it happening at all. It's like, but there may be, just like algae on a pond, if there's a small number of people pushing to develop community again because they see what's going on, they see how it's a spiritual death that we're experiencing over the lack of community, the breakdown of community, then maybe that will start to take hold. That's how movements start again. But at the present time, I feel like people do not feel like they have any agency to be able to turn around that permanent lie that Chris Hedges talks about, and to be able to turn around the inverted totalitarianism that has taken hold in governments now.
If the system rewards those that are horrible, the powerful are the greedy. They'll step on you and they'll kill you to get to the top. I mean, How does the left have a chance?
Disconnecting from the system. And, it's Alexander Harrison's great line, speaking to a bunch of revolutionaries, we think we're the doctor, we're the disease. We have to destroy the system. And that means...
Exactly. We have to destroy the system. And that means ending capitalism. And it means... and socialism isn't necessarily the answer if we're going to carry on as if there's unlimited resources on the planet and that we can have unrestrained economic growth. Even if it is a socialist society, we have to have a different approach to the planet. We have to have a different approach to other sentient beings on the planet that are not human. And that means going vegan and stop exploiting them because they're another species. Stop killing 2 trillion plus land and aquatic animals every year for completely trivial reasons and mostly palate pleasure. We don't need to do any of that. We don't need animal products at all to survive. We can easily meet all our nutrition requirements from plants and other non-animal sources. So we don't need to exploit non-human animals, and we don't need to be thinking that there has to be continual growth and that it's okay to just keep on populating the planet, and we don't give a toss about the non-human animals and whether or not they have any more habitat. And this whole world is their habitat. But we carry on as if it's okay to just continue populating the planet. And this isn't some sort of Malthusian thing about some racist thing that this is actually literally about the human species overpopulating the planet and driving out 99.99% of the planet's population. And that's outrageous. It's a human supremacist thing. So we have to have a totally different view of other animals, and that means going vegan, and we have to have a different way of viewing how we're going to exist in the world, because unless we have some sort of a vision which isn't about continual economic growth, then we're never going to, if it was possible to avoid human extinction, which I don't think it is at this point, but if it was, we're never going to achieve that. We're never going to avoid it. So we really have to have some sort of vision, otherwise we're lost, and that's what governments lack, vision. They just constantly reacting, constantly trying to get re-elected, and they have no vision.
Speaking to a bunch of revolutionaries, we think we're the doctor, we're the disease. We have to destroy the system. And that means mass civil disobedience. It means non-cooperation. It means obstructing in every way possible the ability of this system to function. That's our only hope. And we don't, climate change alone means that window is closing very, very swiftly.
I agree. Nonviolent civil disobedience is definitely the way to go, and it's sad that Extinction Rebellion continues to ignore veganism despite the fact that animal agriculture is one of the major drivers of the climate emergency, but they just continue to ignore it. In fact, they promote so-called sustainable animal agriculture, which is a joke. And I'll explain that in another video, why that idea of sustainable animal agriculture is not only promoting violence, but it's also promoting just a complete delusion, and it's basically a nonsense.
People will kill us, and they will in the end carry out crimes of humanity that make what the Nazis or the Stalinists did look like child's play. They are now pushing us towards the complete extinction of the human species, and nothing will stop them because they are psychopathic figures who believe only in their own personal enrichment at the expense. I mean, Mike Pompeo is cheering the melting of the polar ice caps because it will expose natural resources. Not only do you not want people like Pompeo and others to be in positions of leadership, but they are a guarantor that you and certainly your children will suffer tremendous misery and early death. And we can't play games with these people anymore.
Very poignant ending there with Chris Hedges, but he's absolutely right. These people are going to take us to the end of life as we know it on this planet. And of course, it'll take pretty much every other species with us. And so that's why he says nonviolent civil disobedience and breaking the machine is all we have left. And I totally agree with that. I don't know if we can actually organize anymore to do that. People have to get out on the streets to do that, get out from behind their devices and do that. And we have to have some sort of a common goal, all of us, and actually recognize what is going on before us. But I'm not sure how many people do. I think there are a lot of people retreating into the bread and circuses type thing that happened in the Roman Empire. People were kept amused by all sorts of, the Colosseum and the empire trying to keep them amused. And I think that's where we're at too, where there is just so much, we're bombarded by constant information, and a lot of it's nonsense, and people aren't even paying attention really. We're walking headlong into the end, where eventually it'll be starvation for most of us, and a lot of us don't even realize that's happening. So it's very, very sad indeed. So yes, we're going to need some real awakening that won't be, I'm not talking about an awakening where suddenly we don't have anything to eat, because that's way too late. But we need to be waking up now and, as he said, breaking the machine. Anyway, thanks so much for listening. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals and Vega. Please click the like button if you like the content. Please hit the notification bell, otherwise you don't receive notifications when a video drops. And hit the like button if you like the content. So thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.